Hey guys, this is Infinite Flash here. Today I'm going to be talking about some Leningrad Dutch sidelines. And I guess the first one I'm going to talk about today is, this one, I guess, let's start with these moves, is that, in this kind of position, white can also play a little bit more sneaky. He can play like this move, knight h3 after this move. Knight h3, white sometimes wants to play this kind of knight f3 move, controlling b5 and d4 squares. But in this line, the knight, it's not so obvious what it does, but the bishop, it's not blocked by this knight on f3. On h3, it's also planning to go to the f4 square. So against this kind of sideline, you got to be really, really careful. So I guess the normal move is castles. Makes a lot of sense. And then castles. And here, black continues with his normal setup with d6. And, this knight might come to f4 right now, but usually, white wants to continue developing with knight c3. Makes a lot of sense. These two squares white wants to control. As black already has a pawn here that wants to control that kind of square. You might come here with the knight on e4 later on. And in this kind of position, I don't really like the positions with black has a few options here. You can play like knight c6, you can play c6, and he can play this other move that I like. But I guess I can show you why I don't really like the move c6 in this specific position. After c6, white can play this d5 move. And the normal kind of response against this kind of move is, c5, but, I'm not really liking this kind of position, really. Maybe white goes like rook b1, b3, bishop b2, and, eventually he tries to get e4 in, knight f4, and the e6 square is potentially going to be hopped undo, and if something takes it there, then white has this monstrous bishop across this diagonal. That's a bit general. I know that, but I don't really like the entire setup with this c6 move. Usually black plays e5 and tries to free his game, but white just takes. And, in this kind of position, white often has, I think the move in specific here was knight g5. And, black doesn't really want to retreat this bishop. It doesn't feel kind of right here. Actually, never mind, c4 saying, excuse me. So in this position, excuse me about that, sorry about that, usually white plays queen b3. And if black plays this kind of move, then you can go with knight g5. Excuse me about that. Sorry about that, guys. And b7's hanging, and white plans to just take here, and followed by takes here. So a move like bishop c8 is not that fun to play, and a move like b6 just giving away the bishop pair. And white having good central control, is not ideal either. You could also play this knight a6 double pawn sack. That leads to pretty interesting play, as the c4 pawn is going to be taken next turn. But I'm not entirely sure about this kind of position. It's worth investigating. I don't think black's doing that badly in this specific position after he gets this kind of compensation. Looks like his pieces are pretty active, and he has good control of the e4 square and with the c file. Maybe he can make use of the b file with his queen at some point, or maybe a rook. This isn't half bad for black, but what, I like the move that I'm thinking of instead of c6. Another move that also seems kind of reasonable is this knight c6 move, trying to get e5 in. And normally this move is kind of okay, but I guess in this instance, white can play d5. And, knight a5 is a little bit different. but I think white can just play queen d3, and I mean this knight's ready to jump on e6, ready to play knight e6, and maybe white plays e4 and breaks open the e file very quickly. This is the problem with the knight a5 setups. This knight's kind of left on the edge of the board, and sometimes you want it in play towards the center, towards the central squares here. Something more important. And I understand that black's attacking this pawn, but that's it. That's all this knight does really. It prepares c5 eventually, but I mean I don't really like this kind of position. The move I want to recommend in this kind of position is e5. Just going straight forward for a break. And I mean, I guess we can start off with a move like d5. Probably black can just play a5, and the idea is that black wants to play this knight a6 move, probably jump here on with knight c5, and the point with a5 was to prevent this b4 pawn push kicking in from here. So there's a lot of ways of going about this kind of position. You don't even have to go a5, by the way. You can also just go knight a6, straight up, and this kind of plan with knight here. Although here, I mean, maybe white could play f3 once the knight gets there, so it's pretty tricky. Maybe, yeah, like I said, a5 is not that bad. So I guess play would continue. It's hard to say what white's move is. Maybe b3, here, knight c5. I'm not sure. I mean, the play usually develops from here. Maybe white can go e4. It's not really that clear to me what's going on in these kind of positions. Black always has this idea of bringing the knight back and pushing the f-pawn. Supporting this King's Indian-like center. It's very, very reminiscent of the King's Indian. So if we go back, e5 is a good move, I think. And if white takes, usually you want to play this kind of c6 move to control this d5 square. This is a really, really annoying and tender square for black a lot of the times in this knight, whenever black plays e5, because he has not committed to, he hasn't played e6 yet, so he has to play this kind of move to control the d5 square. And in this kind of position, if white takes, I think we've seen this before, that black doesn't really have any problems whatsoever. I don't even see what white would do in this kind of position. With knight b5, then knight a6. c7, this is defended properly. Black plays c6 next, and kicks out this knight for good. And I don't really see a good response, honestly, for white against that. It's not that bad. I mean, there's no way black is better in that position, but I think black's doing fine. Maybe he can play bishop e3, maybe bishop c5 to gain a tempo against this rook. But, I mean, against this move, I think still c6, and if you gain a tempo, I don't really think this matters too much. And even though you have a nice lead in development, this knight is kind of junky. I mean, what did it do? I mean, now that f4 square is gone, this bishop's fighting on this pawn, this knight's fighting on this pawn. It controls both of those key squares, and it's not so obvious what this bishop does. Bishop e7 is not really a problem, probably because of probably rook d7, and you don't mind that, and this bishop now is in the way, somewhere along this diagonal, and you can move the rook again or something and try to develop with your pieces. So, I mean, white can also just, take and try to play for his lead in development, maybe with the other rook first, actually. But I don't really think that this kind of position is too much of a problem. It shouldn't be. An emergency. I think this is h6, and maybe black wants to bring his king towards the center and try to develop from here. Maybe these kind of ideas. This position looks perfectly okay to me for black. I don't think this is should be too much of a problem. Okay, and to be fair, I just noticed that this c6 pawn is tender, so maybe black can play e4 at some point as well to take some space and You open this bishop up and block this bishop when this pawn's here. I don't think black should be that bad in this kind of position. I mean, maybe there's some way for white to get some weird kind of advantage, but I mean, you shouldn't be worried about it. Yeah, and kind of to prevent this e5 move, sometimes white plays d5 here, right? You know, if now e5 then takes, and you know, if bishop takes, then bishop takes b7, and whoops, you just dropped. So you gotta be really, really careful. You can't play e5 just yet. But I think I've shown you guys that this knight a6 move, trying to go maybe here, or perhaps, you know, a5 here. We kind of get in this theme, right? Going knight c5, and you know, basically bishop d7 and e5 or c5 at some point. Maybe if this knight goes somewhere, it might also go to b4 at some point, but probably not soon. Maybe the play unfolds like maybe white can go for a quick e4, but I don't think I'm that afraid of this kind of position. It doesn't really make maybe just takes first. My bad. And you know, oh, this knight is strange. Maybe knight e4 then. In any case, maybe maybe b3. Oh, that drops too. Strange. Rook b1 maybe, and you know, this kind of position. I think we've already talked about this one. Maybe you can go knight e4 in this kind of position, and I don't think black has any problems whatsoever. Not at the moment. Maybe just bishop d7 here. You can. I love this word gnaw, but you can kind of gnaw at the center. And maybe you can also play h6 combined with e5 in this kind of position. That looks quite acceptable to me as for for black. That's also an idea. I mean, the whole knight h3 thing it's probably not that bad for white. It's probably decent. You know, maybe white has a little bit better in these kind of lines, but I'm just showing you black's ideas. So just showing you the ideas and not really concerned about theory that much. So I guess the next part is, you know, talking about what does black do against non-G3 systems in the Leningrad. You know, sometimes white doesn't have to play G3, right? You can start out maybe with knight f3. And in this kind of position, black can play like g6 still. And, you know, maybe white wants to play, I don't know, bishop f4 or something and go for kind of a London system. I don't think this system, I don't think it's that great for white. This kind of setup, d3, bishop d3. And, you know, you can always play like knight, maybe h6 first, and, you know, knight h5, or maybe knight h5 straight up, threatening the bishop. And I mean, you're just threatening e5 in this kind of position, and queen e8 maybe to help push this e5 pawn through. And you're not really worried about this kind of knight jump here because of this, you know, the same kind of theme with knight here. And this should be okay for black. I'm just showing you ideas. I mean, maybe there's some tactical something tactically wrong with this kind of position, but that's this should be okay for black, really. I mean, if white just continues developing normally, I mean, probably c6 to control this d5 square, and followed by e5, and I don't really think black should have any really big problems in this kind of position. You know, there's also this idea of just going knight c6 as, you know, I've shown you guys before, the knight e5. You know, to put this knight on e5 if white pushes d5. I mean, the entire setup is kind of weird, in my opinion. And, you know, in this kind of positions, maybe white will go bishop g5, but you shouldn't be afraid of, you know, this kind of setup where, you know, white tries to open up the center. I mean, this kind of position is very, very nice. Probably bishop g7, d6, c6, or maybe d6, bishop f5. And this white bishop's not that great since the pawn is on c4. I'm not a big fan of this kind of early break in the center. Probably if he wants to do this kind of setup, he can also, get this early e4. He can have it often, with this early g3. If you kind of come back to this early Leningrad I was talking about. White can also play this interesting sideline, probably with, in early e4, but I don't think this is much of a problem at all for black. He just, develops normally. And there's, this kind of move, knight f3 in this kind of position is already getting awkward. The bishop kind of feels weird over here. And probably white has to play like a move like knight e2, trying to get his bishop back and not stopping the path with the knight move. Knight h3 seems weird because it just drops. But yeah, and here just knight c6, putting some pressure on the pawn. Castles. Yeah, in order here, maybe bishop h3, rook e1. I don't think black has any problems whatsoever. Maybe queen d7, bishop f5 at some point, and bishop g4. Black has really, really nice development. He can probably play e6, e5 at some point. And I don't really see the big idea in the grand scheme of things with, that e4 did. It doesn't look like it helped at all. Opening the center is not always great with a move like e4. Maybe sometimes you have to have a reason behind a move like e4. Maybe I can adjust to a plan against, your nice bishop over here trying to attack the pawn. That's also one thing you guys want to watch out for. Premature breaks in the center, like this one. Let's see. Kind of going back to this normal setup, maybe white wants to play conservatively with this kind of setup, right? d6, and here in this kind of position, maybe knight c3 or something. In this kind of position, black can play knight c6 and kind of go for this, setup. But I recommend something safer against this e3. It's not necessary to play knight c6. You can if you want, but I don't want to play that. Maybe going for this solid queen e8 system is pretty good. Going for immediate e5 pawn push, and you're not really afraid of knight b5 because of knight a6 and c6 comes and the knight has to go. So against queen e8, black plays e5 and c6 next after that move, and if you play d5, then I guess maybe I can play a6 first, or actually in this position I can play this move first, e5, and now that there's no bishop over here, I can get away with this kind of bishop move, and I don't think black has any problems whatsoever. Here bishop d7. This isn't really anything for white. It's all superficial when you look at it in the end. I guess what I'm going to talk about now is, what if white plays something really, really abstract? What if he doesn't play c4 at all in these kind of positions? What if he plays knight f3? Yeah, against knight f3, you got to be really, really careful. Sometimes you may want to play like g6, and you may nonchalantly just ignore this knight f6 move, right? But the problem with this kind of move is black wants to avoid the weakening of the structure so early, so he doesn't have to commit to the g6 setup so early. And the reason why sorry about that. The reason why you don't want to commit to a g6 setup is so early is that white hasn't played c4, and he can reserve this option for bishop, for a place for his bishop later. So there's one move that I have in mind that takes advantage of this g6 setup, and it's kind of this weird move h4. And at first it doesn't really look clear what white's doing. He's just going to push the pawn, right? But it's not really clear what he does there. For example, if black plays knight h5, and I continue with this move, takes, and white's idea is that he's going to sack here play e4, and the whole thing breaks open. Already knight e5 and queen h5 comes to mind, right? Bishop c4, knight c3. This kind of sacrifice on h5 is very, very dangerous for black. He doesn't usually want to commit to this kind of setup so early without white playing c4. And okay, I mean, white can try this kind of setup with c4 already in, but it's not as potent, in my opinion. But I mean, it's something to look out for. That's why you want to play knight f6 early. And I'm not going to talk about a sideline such as bishop g5 just yet. I'll talk about that in a later video. So, and I guess one other thing I can talk about is what if white goes something like this against when you haven't committed to g6 just yet? Yeah, usually here I would just recommend playing a normal move like b6, bishop b7, e6, probably knight e4 at some point. You have these options with bishop b4 check and bishop e7. It's very, very similar to a Nimzo Indian, or maybe a Queen's Indian with Queen's Indian lines with already this f5 pawn push, making this h4 move look a little bit silly in retrospect, right? I mean, h4 didn't contribute at all to the position. This kind of move is aggressive, and it's for people that don't know much theory, but they just want to kind of punish this f5 pawn push that weakens the king supposedly. So, I mean, in some future videos, what I plan to cover is, definitely these. Probably in my next video, I'm going to be covering either one of these sidelines with bishop g5, knight c3, knight f6, and then either one of these bishop moves. And I'll be covering that sideline in probably the next few videos that I have on the Dutch. And there's also this sideline that I showed you about. E4, that's the Stockton gambit. And there's also this g4 line that's not that bad actually for white. I was surprised when I learned about it. It's not that bad actually. Other than that though, I mean, the Dutch it's a pretty good opening in my book. I don't think it's bad at all. And I mean, what else would I say that you have to worry about here? Hard to say though. I mean, I think I'm going to be covering those again. And guys, I hope you like these kind of videos. If there's something you don't like about the videos, just post a comment saying what you don't like. And I really like some criticism, some comments, anything. I just want to see how I can improve at this kind of stuff. My presentation skills, the audio or video kind of stuff. Just leave that in the comment. Thanks for watching.